I think that we have forgotten about our biology. We have forgotten about our brains. And the more I learn about this, the more I have managed to work my way around my brain's Achilles heels. That's why we need to learn more about the brain. The more we learn about the brain, the freer we become from the brain. Hi, my name is Anders Hansen, and I'm a psychiatrist and a medical doctor. And these are 5 ways to improve your focus. Multitasking makes you less productive. The brain cannot multitask. We think that we're doing several things at once, but in reality we're jumping back and forth from one thing to the other. And the thing to remember about this is that the brain doesn't switch focus immediately. It keeps some focus on what you just did. So when you're writing a text on your computer and then you're sending an SMS, the brain will still keep focus on the text while it's sending the SMS, and so on and so forth. So most of us are not good at multitasking. However, we want to do it because the brain is easily interrupted. Because we constantly need to search for information. We never evolved to focus. And some people say that I'm very good at multitasking, but when you actually check that, you see that the ones who think they're good at multitasking are often the worst at it. And in that group, the majority is men. Women are actually somewhat better at multitasking, but most women are bad at that too. So I think we fool ourselves when we try to multitask. We are terrible multitaskers. The price of attempting to multitask is that your mental bandwidth is reduced. And that probably doesn't make much of a difference if you're doing something very ordinary. But if you really need to focus at work, in school, and so on, then you should try to avoid multitasking. Stop picking up your phone. If you want to understand why our phones are so seductive, it's good to start with a chemical in our brain called dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter and is known as a sort of a pleasure chemical. But that's not the whole truth. The main role of dopamine is not so that we should feel pleasure, it's our engine that directs our focus. It tells us what we should focus on. If I'm hungry and I see food, dopamine levels rise in my brain because it's telling me you should eat that. Now, there's some peculiarities about this dopamine system. One thing is that it likes maybe. It likes uncertain rewards. Why are we built in such a way? Well, the reason is probably that most rewards in nature are stochastic. You do not know whether you will be rewarded if you climb the tree to see if there's banana. You do not know whether the hunt will be successful, and therefore the brain rewards uncertain outcomes. And this is something that's being exploited in us by casinos and gaming companies. And it's also being exploited by social media companies. They distribute likes so that we don't get all the likes immediately. If you post a picture on Facebook and your friends click thumbs up, you don't get to see the likes when they are posted. Facebook distributes them so that you should constantly come back and see whether there's something new. So your phone is basically a big casino, a big slot machine. And this is just one of many hacks that tech companies have used to grab our attention, because our attention is the most valuable thing in the world. Our phones are incredibly efficient at increasing dopamine levels in our brains. And the consequence of that is that we don't pay attention to the rest of the world. The rest of the world does not give us so much dopamine. And there was this experiment made when you have people sitting and talking to a stranger for 10 minutes. They sit in front of one another and there's a table in between. And on half of these tables, there's a notebook, just a paper and a pen. And on the other half of these tables, there's a phone. And then you ask these people, how interesting was this conversation? And it turns out that the pairs who had a phone between them did not think that the conversation was as interesting. They didn't even think that the person they were talking to was so reliable. Our digital devices makes us less interested in other people. And perhaps even a bit more suspicious. And this is something to be aware of, I think, when you're sitting at the table, when you're having dinner with your friends and so on. Leave the phone outside, because you're having this thing in your pocket that billions and billions of dollars has been poured into to make you pay attention to it. There's been studies made where you have students doing tests for focus and memory, and half of them leave their phones outside the room. And the ones who have it with them, they don't pick it up. It's just in their pocket. And it turns out the ones who have left it outside the room perform better. And that's very strange. And the reason is probably that the phone is so addictive, it rewards us with so much dopamine that we constantly need to inhibit the impulse to pick it up. I should not pick up my phone, I should not pick up my phone, I should not pick up my phone. And then your mental bandwidth is somewhat reduced. They are so seductive that we will pick them up. There's no way around that. So we need to create distance to them. That's my main advice. Be aware of how incredibly powerful these technologies are and that someone is making money from every time you spend on them. Sleep is underrated. Sleep is very strange. Why should we go into a state where we are unconscious for 7 or 8 or 9 hours? I mean, if sleep did not fulfill an important function, it would be evolution's biggest mistake. Sleep is a phase where the brain performs many important functions. It decides what of the experience that we had during the day that it should be kept. It's figuring out new ways to see things, so it's very important for creativity. We know also that the brain is working through difficult memories in a state where it's calm. It's like a nightly therapy. So sleep is incredibly important for stabilizing our mood. Poor sleep reduces our attention, and I think everyone has experienced that. We sleep less now than we used to. It's very difficult to say exactly how much less, but some studies suggest that we sleep 1 hour less than we did 100 years ago. And in Sweden, the number of children and teenagers who are seeking help for sleeping disorders have increased by more than 1,000% since the year 2000. That's just staggering. And no one knows why that is. But I think it's fair to say that digital media are partly responsible for this. A study showed that a third of all teenagers had their phone in their bed, not on the table beside their bed, but in their bed. And to have all your friends, to have a casino and all the information and all the entertainment in the world, well, that's not going to get you to sleep. So my main advice for patients seeking help for sleeping disorders, and they are many, my main advice to them is get the phone out of the bedroom. Buy an old-fashioned alarm clock. That's the first advice. And my second advice is exercise. Exercise improves sleep. It makes us fall asleep faster, and it also gives us more deep sleep. And before you have tried these things, I don't think you should, in most cases, even consider sleeping pills. Exercise increases our ability to focus. We know now that the blood flow to the brain increases by about 20% when we are physically active. And that means that the brain gets more oxygen and more nutrients, and therefore it functions better. So increased blood flow to the brain is probably one of the reasons why our ability to focus is improved when we exercise. Now, the really interesting question is, why are we built that way? Why does the brain function better if we move? We don't need our cognitive functions when we're walking or running. And the answer to this is, I think, that the brain is a very energy-consuming organ. It consumes about 20 to 25% of all of the energy in the body. And as the rest of the body, the brain wants to be energy efficient. It only functions as good as it has to function. And when did the brain have to function at its peak? That was when we moved. For 99.9% of our history, it was when we moved that we saw new things. That's when we needed our focus the most. That's when we needed our creativity the most. If the brain had evolved for today's world, it would be at its peak in front of a computer. And therefore, exercise becomes, from our perspective, a way to hack evolution, a way to exploit a way that we are built in order to function better in our modern society. So it would be natural to think that the best way to reduce stress would be to relax. And to some degree, that's true, of course. We need to relax, and I think, to be bored. But we should not forget the role of exercise, because exercise makes us more tolerant to stress. Exercise teaches the body not to react so strongly to stress, regardless of what caused that stress in the first place. When we are in good shape, we were better equipped to handle the things that stressed us historically, such as lions and so on. We don't have to establish panic for every possible threat if we are in good shape. And since we use the same system for modern stressors, we thereby get better equipped to handle them as well. The brain, use it or lose it. Well, we do not know what consequences outsourcing things to our devices will have for the brain, but there was a study done here in London where you had hippocampus measured, and hippocampus is often called the memory center of the brain, and you have people who were aspiring to become taxi drivers, has to learn the map of London, and there's 20 or even 30,000 streets, incredible amount of knowledge. The brains of these applicants were scanned before this learning process started and after, and it turned out that the ones who succeeded, their hippocampus had grown, especially the posterior part of the hippocampus had grown. So the brain had grown because it had practiced a new thing. And this shows, I think, that the brain is like a muscle. If you don't use it, it will not function as good anymore. So what consequences will it have in the long run that we use this more and more and more? Well, we do not know that. There has been experiments made where you have individuals going to museum. Some of them take photographs of the art, and some of them just look at the art, and then you test them the day after to see how well they remember the art. Then you see that the ones who have taken pictures don't remember as much. And that's probably because the brain realizes that, okay, I don't need to remember this. This is somewhere else. We can't Google everything. Society is incredibly complex. We will lose something on the way. We don't seem to get immune to digital distractions. We get more and more and more distracted by them. How do we know that? Well, we know that, for instance, by comparing a physical book to a screen. If you read the exact same text in a physical book compared to on a screen, you learn more in the physical book. You learn more details and you understand the context better, especially if it's a difficult text. We don't know why the physical book is better, but comparisons between screen and books have been done for many years now, and the difference between book and screen is increasing. And that's not because the book is getting better, it's because screens are getting worse. And that shows that we don't get used to digital distractions, we get even more and more and more distracted by them. And as a consequence, it's getting more and more difficult for us to understand and read and digest more complicated stuff. The main thing I would like people to remember from this book is that the brain has not evolved for happiness or intelligence or creativity. The brain has evolved for survival and reproduction. And the brain has not changed during the last 10 or even 20,000 years. If we really understand that, not just as a line, as a cliche, but really understand that, then you learn a lot about yourself. And you will understand why sleep is so important. You will understand why exercise is so important. You will understand why your attention is so fragile and so vulnerable. And from that knowledge, I think you will make changes based on how your life is. I have certainly done that, and it's been very valuable for me, and it's been very valuable for many of my patients as well. Thanks for watching this. You can get my book, The Attention Fix, in audio, ebook, and of course physical book in the link below. And don't forget to subscribe to Penguin for more videos like this one.